Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Down the years you may have seen me on the telly or heard me on the wireless, but this is different. This is the Brian Taylor podcast, brought to you by the Herald.
Nicola Sturgeon was lucky that the rail strike had been called off just in time, but with regard to the cleansing workers, I mean, it's evident that it is causing a problem, that there is rubbish bulging out of the bins, and it just is not a good look.
We fundamentally need China and the US to lead. Between them, if they're not doing something, the world's not going to do it. And it's as simple as that.
Help us have more powers, better powers, so that we can do what we want to help move forward the climate emergency agenda.
Hello, I'm Brian Taylor. A huge welcome to my latest Herald podcast. Now, this is going to be a COP26 special. We'll give a big amount of coverage to that before we get to all of that quite remarkable developments as we go on air just in the last few minutes in that row over the behaviour of the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson. In the last few minutes, he has announced that he is quitting. He's standing down as an MP. Let's go straight to that topic. I'm joined by David Ball from the Herald. David, a startling U-turn by the UK government preceded this announcement by Mr Paterson, didn't it?
That's right. As you mentioned, he has just announced in the last few minutes that he has resigned as an MP after a massive U-turn by the UK government this morning. He was found to have broken sort of lobbying rules, and he was facing suspension until sort of Tory MPs blocked it by calling for sort of an overhaul to the standards watchdog, which caused a huge backlash. He initially had the backing of Number 10, but Downing Street is kind of in PM There's a lot of anger around in the papers as well today. And Mr Paterson's now said he wants a life outside of the cruel world of politics.
Quite remarkable developments. Joined by David, thanks. Stay with us. Joined by three prominent MSPs: Emma Harper for the SNP, Rachael Hamilton for the Conservatives and Labour's Daniel Johnson. Emma Harper, first of all, what do you make of this announcement of the resignation of Owen Paterson?
Well, it was quite interesting to hear that just ahead of coming on to do the podcast today. I think it's really interesting that, it doesn't change the fact that the Tories are trying to rewrite the rule book and, continue to think it's okay that we can have corruption and cronyism and the Tories just run roughshod over parliamentary proper scrutiny.
He says he's innocent. He says he's innocent and he's quitting to clear his name.
Well, he wasn't found innocent, and there's been some obviously backlash about it. So my concern is that we need to make sure that our politicians are able to be scrutinised and that everything is transparent. So that would be my concern, is that he might say he's resigned because he wants to have life outside of politics, but it doesn't rewrite the fact that the Tories have tried to change the rule book.
Rachael Hamilton, what do you make of this announcement by Owen Paterson?
Well, I think, as you say, Brian, he wants to be able to give them the chance to appeal in a process that he believes that has flaws within that process, but also he wants to clear his name. And I think this is the only way that he is able to do that out with the parliamentary process. I don't support changing the rules, and I believe that an independent process should be allowed to run its course. It seemed as though there was a comparison to how politicians were treated compared to other disciplinary processes that go on in other sectors, perhaps in industry or in the private sector, public sector. So I think what was interesting this morning was Jacob Rees-Mogg's sort of fair assessment to where we were, and that at the point in time, any amendments would be looked upon separately to the case of Owen Paterson, and that changes to the system would only be sought with a cross-party basis. So I think it was interesting the way that the government did U-turn. They did make steps to move towards a sort of more conciliatory process, but in the meantime, Owen Paterson has decided to resign to perhaps clear his own name.
Well, you mentioned there, Rachael, that this was a screeching U-turn by the Leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg. What do you make of the handling of this issue, this whole episode, by your own dear party?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that we should be looking at a sort of the independent process. However, I am pretty horrified at the way that suddenly after Sir David Amess's death, suddenly a lot of people came under vitriol because of this whole process. So I do think lessons have to be learned, because we don't want MPs once again facing offices being vandalised, and do need to have a process. Well, yes, this morning, Brian, I was following it on the television, and I think it was Peter Bone and Andrew Jones, I think, was the victim of some quite serious sort of vitriol. So I think we just need to be very careful, because we're in this situation where people react very strongly to situations, and so I think it could have been handled a lot better. The way that things happened in the last parliamentary session here, I could argue that they weren't handled in terms of various people misleading Parliament, but this is a very important.
Now you're conflating all the issues. This is a bit interesting that you're even linking Owen Paterson with Sir David. I don't know how corruption can be linked with other things. I think what we need is politicians to be basically able to be scrutinised. We want folk to be honest and truthful and transparent. I don't think be conflating the issues.
Daniel Johnson, you've been patient.
Yeah, I think Emma's right, and actually I'd go a little bit further. I just think there is a link to what happened to David Amos. Look, I think we have to do better in politics than this, and I in some ways I have a lot of respect to Rachael for trying to sort of present what is a really, I think, botched set of decisions from the government in a reasonable way. Because
to be fair, Daniel, Rachael was quite clear she felt it had been mishandled.
No, I know, but I mean, because I think it's an absolute mess. Because ultimately, what has happened here is someone has used their position as an MP to get access that benefits companies that they were a paid consultant for. Now, that's just about as bad as it gets. And I remember very well all the issues in the 90s, the brown envelopes, everything that happened around, the FIED payments to Neil Hamilton and so on. And we said, this cannot happen. It must not happen again. And we set up, and it is an independent process. And I think there is an argument to be made for the need for an appeals and how those things are handled, but it is independent. And critically, unless I've got the facts very badly wrong, those exact situations of someone being paid and using the access they have as an MP, for those companies is exactly what has happened here.
Thanks, Daniel. Rachel, I'm really keen to get on to COP26, but your party's been mentioned a lot there. You've been mentioned. A quick final word from you on this topic.
Well, I think it's important that within a situation where there's a lack of an appeal process, that we need to recognise that there is a flaw in that system, and that people do need to be able to present their case if they feel they are innocent. Now, we're not arguing about anything other than the fact that perhaps there were mistakes made yesterday, but I do believe that Owen Paterson has the right to defend himself. He believes that he has he has the means to do so, and indeed he wasn't able to call evidence in this situation. But let me be clear, I do agree totally in the independent process.
Thanks for that, and thanks for the comments on that point. Just to remind people who maybe just tuning into this podcast, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Owen Paterson is resigning as an MP. He's quitting. He's stepping down. He says he's intent on clearing his name following accusations. It follows a U-turn by the Leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who announced that there would be a review of the procedures at the House, but it would not be retrospective to cover the case of Mr. Paterson. Let's move to COP26. A quite incredible series of developments there, a series of announcements, a series of pronouncements. We're going to ask in this podcast whether action will match the promises made. We'll look at Scotland's record. We'll look at the impact of COP26 itself upon Glasgow with our three colleagues here. Hoping to get David Ball from the Herald back from the the COP26 venue there. I'm sure we'll catch up with him as soon as possible. Just mentioning in passing, you can get full access to the Herald's COP26 summit coverage for free with a trial offer. Details at heraldscotland.com/subscribe. And of course, as ever, 20% off, basically an offer from this programme, and 20% off the annual subscription using the exclusive code HeraldPod2021. Even I can work that one out. HeraldPod2021. Big announcement today, loads of big announcements. Let's go with that. The big announcement being the end of coal in sight. 190 countries signing up, but not Australia, not the US, not India, not China. Let's talk to our panel on that. Emma, what do you make of this? It's a big announcement, but the really big coal users are not there. Is this something of a trend at COP26? Do you feel, is there some anxiety about that?
I think we should obviously be concerned about that. And one of the things that COP's not done yet. It's not over. So obviously there'll be continued engagement and negotiations taking place. But I would really be keen to continue to lobby these other countries that are not signing up the way the ones that I had listed are the smaller countries. I would really encourage them to get on board and make some commitments to reduce their coal output and get, I guess, further forward with a whole renewable energy transition.
I mean, we'll talk about that in a minute. The First Minister today announcing attempts to make Scotland a renewable powerhouse, I think she said. Rachael, what about this business of will the action match the promises on the end of coal in sight, the other issues like methane and deforestation? What do you think? Is the action going to match the rhetoric?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think COP26, I've been there for the last 2 days, in and out from Parliament across to COP26, joining various fringe events. And I mean, first of all, it has been an amazing opportunity for people to gather together to discuss one common theme, which is meeting climate change goals. And I think all the global leaders and the global players really sought to make progress in the first couple of days. I mean, I was really excited about the commitment to deforestation, and I think that was significant commitment, for example, by Brazil. And we know that the Amazon rainforests, which have been causing so much, of a problem in terms of the emissions. But it is important to recognise that everybody has to be a player here. And I think there was 189 global signatories to, and players within this who signed the Paris Climate Agreement. But China have to play their part. I mean, they have grown from a very poor country to a very successful, economically significant world player. However, their carbon emissions are contributing to around about 28% of those global emissions. And I think it's important, to recognise that they haven't actually really, they've not been here. They've not been at COP26. And so not only the people who are relying on fossil fuels, such as Poland or Germany or other countries that are not so significant in our minds, such as Vietnam, they are all signing up to commit to quit coal. So major coal-using countries are committing to that. And China, with all their expertise in technology and innovation, they should be at the forefront of this. And I am slightly disappointed to find, that they're not.
Okay. David's joined us, but I'll bring in Daniel. David, I'll bring you in a couple of seconds if you don't mind. Daniel Johnson, on this point between action and promise. Yeah, go on, please.
And I think we've got two reasons to be worried about this. And I think Rachel's right about one of them, because I think there's a sign here that about a lack of leadership. And we fundamentally need China and the US to lead. Between them, if they're not doing something, the world's not going to do it. And it's as simple as that. But the other thing is sort of picking out India from that. And I was also quite concerned, in a sense, by one of the other so-called good news stories of the creation of this 100 billion fund, because I don't think it's enough. Because ultimately, as well as leadership, we also, I think, need to be helping, the countries in the global south. They're not going to necessarily be able to do it by themselves. So there needs to be this coordination and indeed, I think assistance between countries if we're going to get them over the line. So, yes, good news that we've got the call sign up, but we need the detail. We need leadership, and we also need these mechanisms so that those leaders can help those countries which are maybe finding things more difficult.
Daniel, what did you make in that subject of funding? Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, who's been looking at this as an envoy for the UN, he wants to boost, basically, it's private capital support for clean technology to assist, well, the planet generally, but developing nations perhaps in particular. Do you think, is that the way to go, that private capital can solve the problems that perhaps in centuries by private capitalism caused?
Well, look, I mean, ultimately, yes, because if this is going to work, what we need to do is embed net zero into the fabric of our economies. And that therefore means that it has to be about investment. But I think the thing that I would also say is that, we're talking about, if not outright market failure, at least things that are kind of right at the edge of what markets can cope with. So it needs state actors to lead that investment. I think to sow the foundations or lay the foundations for those investment systems. And it probably also needs a degree of redistribution from north to south. So it's about all of these. I don't think it's about either private sector or the state or the north or the south. I think it's about all of these things working together.
Okay, I'm
going to actually jump in there.
Please, Rachel. Please.
Because again, Daniel's making a good point about everyone working together. I was at the Macaulay lecture with Christina Figueres, and she spoke about being collegiate and working together. And she said that all these global leaders coming together under one tent just need to break down the barriers. And I think making the point that we can help each other is really important, because if you look at the way that that countries such as the United States and the EU, the UK, they've all pledged to help South Africa decarbonise.
Yes.
And I mean, it was outstanding that we heard that India would commit to meeting net zero by 2070. Goodness knows how old we will be by then, Brian, but maybe the aim is to get the planet healthier, us healthier, and we'll be living way beyond 100.
But Rachel, I mean, that you mentioned that 2070 pledge by India. They've got targets for low carbon power on an interim basis by 2030, but they don't plan to be net zero until 2070. That's 20 years after the UN target date of 2050. It's 25 years after the Scottish date. It's so far ahead that you might say, is it a promise worth making at all?
Well, I think we have to start somewhere, and we've sort of got, as you know, a key number of players who are committed to doing all sorts of things in much a quicker timetable. And I think looking in terms of that investment that you're talking about there, speeding up affordable, clean, green technology, and looking at all the areas such as power and transport and using hydrogen and looking at the emissions and the methane emissions in agriculture is really, really important. And yesterday, a lot of the NFU groups, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and the rest of the UK, they all came together and they were talking about how agriculture can be part of the solution. So if we can start small, we can start to reach out and kind of go global even more, should I say?
So I think India is a really important
point. Yeah, please.
Because it's a huge country, and in a sense, I think in a microcosm, it captures the challenge we have ahead of us. Because that isn't quick enough, but at least it's a start. So I think what we should be using is going, great, how can we get you there quicker? And the reality is, if India's going to get there quicker, it's not just about sort of a bit of investment here or there. Some of it's really fundamental, because so much of India is still really poor. It's not like China. So if they're going to be net zero, it's not just about green power generation. It's actually about, some of it's about the fundamentals of things like public health and sanitation. And so what we should be doing is going, great, India, great, you've got the commitment. It needs to be quicker. What help do you need? And we should be looking at things like sanitation and public health so that they can.
David, I'm keen to bring you in, but Emma's desperate to get in there.
I'm actually because I know 2070 is a long time away, and obviously we need to work in partnership, but dates can be revised. And Daniel's right. If we're saying, okay, you've got this goal, well, how can we enable you to maybe set target dates a bit earlier? And the Scottish government have already made commitments to help support emerging economies, including in the global south, to do work. I think there's funding announced for Malawi that has been announced with the Scottish government, and the First Minister was really keen to make sure that voices that aren't normally heard will be heard. She took a question in chamber today about that, and I think is participating in a meeting next week, it's a meeting for women. So we need to make sure that we do reach out and engage and use whatever tools in our toolbox to help get dates revised if that's what we need to do.
David, I see you've shifted ground there. As did the ghost in Hamlet. It was a wonderful, wonderful planet you had behind you. Now I'm not quite sure that's quite supportive. David, seriously, what's the mood at the conference? Are they delighted that the announcements have gone beyond what people expected? But is the expectation that when it comes to delivery, well, President Xi's not there, President Putin's not there, is it going to happen? What's the mood on the ground? Our party representatives have all been there, but you're actually at the COP at the moment.
That's right. I think the Globe was oversubscribed on the Wi-Fi, unfortunately. I think the mood is quite positive. Like, obviously, it's disappointing that China haven't signed up to these big coal agreements. We have to bear in mind that a lot of our manufacturing takes place in China. A lot of Europe is basically offset to China. So we're looking at a circular economy in Europe and particularly Scotland, and that's going to be a huge chunk of that as well. And India, just the fact that they've acknowledged that net zero is a thing is a huge win, I think, for the global community. Scaling up the renewables by 2030 in India quite significantly is a huge step in the right direction. And I think it's fully expected that 2070 will come down close to the 2050 as we move on and technology helps them out.
But crucially, people you speak to are looking at the scope of the announcement rather than the scope of, if you like, the derogation and the caveats.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the coal announcements today have been positive, that it's a step in the right direction. The big players are missing. That's the big problem. Yes, but the mood music is pretty positive in general here. The first day was very glum. I mean, we all saw Boris Johnson's speech, which was...
Was that the reason for everybody being glum? No, I shouldn't have.
But it has switched since then. And
after Boris left.
Yeah, after Boris left.
Backed up a lot. Yeah.
You're not supposed to be smiling at those jokes, Rachael.
I'm actually just admiring Boris's use of words. He is a wordsmith, and I think he did inject a little bit of personality into the whole of COP26, because it can sometimes be a little bit dry, but he explains things in an individual way, let me say, and I think that's
one way of putting it.
Is he committed? Do you think he's actually, sometimes you wonder whether he's committed to it. I mean, is it a good look, for example, that he left COP26 on a private jet to fly to a dinner at the Garrick Club with his former colleagues from the Telegraph? Is that really a good look?
All global leaders have a very busy schedule, and at some point in time they're going to have to use aviation. And I am told that the plane that he uses is a carbon, a new carbon technology.
Yeah, I'm told Boris's plane is fueled purely on hot air, Brian.
Which he gathered in the Glasgow district, did he? Emma, let's move back to the delivery. We're talking there about, really interested in the point that was coming out to you about North and South. This promise of money for the poorer nations. It was meant to happen by 2020. It hasn't happened yet. It's not yet delivered. It keeps being repeated. It's jam tomorrow. Do you think that's is that a problem? Is that an element of a problem for the wider endeavour to keep the planet together on this, Emma?
Well, I know that the Scottish Government have made an announcements for money to go to Malawi, as I said, and I think obviously that Scotland doesn't have full fiscal control. We don't have control of all the levers of where we would prefer to send money to if we were going to help support it. So what I suppose, I can't really speak for the First Minister, or for Kate Forbes, our Finance Secretary. But I think what I would be, if I were them, I'd be like, help us have more powers, better powers, so that we can do what we want to help move forward the climate emergency agenda. There's some great ideas, there's some great progress has been made, and we in Scotland want to be part of this progressive social democracy and help support other countries, especially in the global south, to help them tackle climate emergency as well.
Interesting.
Rachel, you don't need extra powers, Emma. You could use the powers that you had to meet the climate change targets that you're failing to do. So, for example, you've missed 11 out of the 20 achy biodiversity targets. You have not rolled out the deposit return scheme. You've missed your legal emissions.
We've got a pandemic going on right now as well, and I'm speaking as somebody who is a nurse who's worked during the pandemic, and I see the real challenges that we have. So we can't not talk about COP26 and not talk about the impact of the pandemic.
But also
projects.
Daniel Johnson.
I think it also, in a sense, this discussion also misses the point, because I think that the redistribution of wealth or the cooperation needs to go more than kind of bilateral donations that are kind of based on kind of the individual decisions country. We actually, I think, need to be much more systematic. It requires global cooperation, and I think there need to be mechanisms that deal with it, because I think it's just left to individual countries to decide how big of a check they want to write and where it goes. It's not going to work. So, I don't actually think that our constitutional argument should have anything to do with this conversation, because actually it's a much, much bigger argument than that, one that requires a level of international cooperation and indeed institutional machinery that, quite frankly, we just don't have right now.
But Emma Harper raised the point about powers. Rachael Hamilton, there was some accusations came Nicola Sturgeon's way that she was, with newspaper adverts, etc., using the conference to, declare Scotland a nation in waiting, to raise the subject of independence. She's adamant that is not the case. What's your take on that, Rachael Hamilton?
Well, I'd like to know how much they paid the newspaper to put the great big advert in to advertise and insinuate that an independent Scotland would be the gateway to the climate change world. Well, I mean, I have to argue strongly.
It's normal. It's normal.
No, Emma, let me finish here, because we are. Scotland. I'm proud of Scotland. I'm proud of what we do. I represent a rural constituency, and I'm proud of what our communities are doing in their own little way. But we, as a collective effort here in this Parliament, need to be leading the way. We need to be saying that we're going to meet our climate change targets. We need to be committing to putting in EV charging points so that people can move away from diesel and petrol cars, and they can have the practical measures to do it. At the moment, we've got a £640 million black hole for decarbonising buses. We've got all sorts of targets in terms of the environment that we are not missing. And why, Emma? Tell me why the agri-environmental scheme funding was cut over 3 years by 9 million. I mean, how is that going to help farmers?
Emma Harper.
I specifically can't answer that specific question that Rachel's asking, but I know that Scotland's emissions have been reduced by 51.5% since 1990 baseline. Scotland is doing its bit, and the agricultural stuff, the announcements by Cabinet Secretary last week at the NFU conference is 51 million to help them. I work with a local businessman who's helping support farmers to reduce their emissions on sheep and cattle by making them more efficient so that they gain weight faster. So there is work that's already been taken forward. I'm not on the Rural Committee this session, but I think we are starting to see many of our farmers, whether they're NFU members or not, taking up the opportunity.
Briefly, Emma, was Nicola Sturgeon trying to promote independence through those adverts, or do you think it's just part of the normal routine of life in Scottish politics?
I didn't see the advert, so I can't comment specifically, but the bottom line is, like, if Scotland had all the fiscal levers and the autonomy and the ability to make our own decisions, we would be on the world stage right up with the other wee small countries as a normal independent country. That's the bottom line for me.
Okay, Daniel Johnson, what? Just I'm going to move on to the impact upon Scotland and Glasgow of the conference. What do you see coming from it? Do you see it being there's a series of scenarios, isn't there? There's positive outcomes, positive outcomes on the day, but then they measle away to nothing, and there's collapse. Where do you see it going?
So look, I think there's a couple of things where I think people will see some big contrast between, I think, some of the spin and what's actually happening. And I think first and foremost, I think we're getting some of this COP stuff round the wrong way. It's not an opportunity for Scotland to browbeat them about whatever our particular perspective is. It's an opportunity for us to listen. The world doesn't come to Scotland very often, and actually we don't have all the answers. And actually, I think we should be listening rather than preaching. But I think the other critical thing for people in Glasgow, I think there is a really stark contrast between all this hullabaloo and some of the realities on the ground. And I have to say, I was really struck just walking down Smocky Hall Street to the events, just by the number of toilet boards. There is something not right, and I think we need to talk about it. And it is about jobs, it is about businesses, and I think some people in Glasgow will be asking themselves, they've got all of this stuff going on over here, but what's actually happening to us in our city? And I think the street cleansing is just part of it. But I think there's some real turmoil going on.
That's really interesting. I'm going to bring that up with David Ball. David, what's your? We have the street cleansing strike. We have demonstrations, and some complaints from some of the demonstrators that they've been, as they describe it, kettled. The police would say they're containing it to protect the public. What's your view of the way Glasgow has welcomed COP and the way COP has impacted upon Glasgow? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's quite clear that COP has impacted on Glasgow quite substantially. Yeah. I saw they were being kettled yesterday. I did see some protesters, but the protests are part of a COP, and that is part of what is expected at these big events. It is annoying for anyone who, and the things with the strikes, yes, the bins being collected, it's a horrible message to send out. And a lot of people in Glasgow will think, well, why is this happening in my city? What is in this for me? And if you think, is there a legacy that we're going to get out of COP for Glasgow? Regardless of what happens in the talks, what is the impact? We talk about what happened after the Commonwealth Games, whether there was a legacy for Glasgow. And you have to think, is that going to happen at COP26? Is there going to be something to be remembered?
Nicola Sturgeon was asked at First Minister's questions, wasn't she, David, about the, I presume you saw it. She said she was disappointed that the industrial action had gone ahead after a revised offer was made with additional money coming from the Scottish government. But she had the utmost respect for the cleansing workers, and you had to accept that in some conditions Labour would be withdrawn. What did you make of those exchanges? It was Paul Sweeney from Labour raising them with her as well.
Well, at the end of the day, the unions are there to get the best deal for their workers.
Yeah. And they took the advantage, presumably, of COP26 to do so.
Exactly, and they had every right to do that. That's what unions are there for. They are there to fight the corner of the workers. Obviously, the ScotRail one was looking pretty. That would have had a huge impact, not just on Glasgow, but on everyone attending, and would have given more attention to the disruption. But yeah, people. Last week at First Minister's questions, the First Minister wasn't happy with Anna Sawa bringing it up and basically saying he was talking down Glasgow by just pointing out these quite simple issues that shouldn't be happening.
Okay, Rachael, what's your take on the timing of the cleansing workers strike and the comments from the First Minister?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that having been at COP26 and having been at some fringe events over the last couple of days, what strikes me about Glasgow, it has a wonderful, unique atmosphere. It's vibrant.
Yes, it is.
There's beautiful parts. And last night, I felt that walking between Waterloo Place and Hope Street, I found that there was more rubbish on the streets and more police on the streets than there actually were human beings walking around the street. And I felt a bit saddened by that, and I think that the Nicola Sturgeon was lucky that the rail strike had been called off just in time, and that there'd been a pay deal struck. But with regard to the cleansing workers, it's evident that it is causing a problem. That there is rubbish bulging out of the bins, and it just is not a good look. Because what we want, and I think we can all agree on this, is what we want is for Glasgow to have a legacy. as David says, a bit like the Commonwealth legacy. And I think that I'm wondering if there will be, because there's been so many difficulties. Nicola Sturgeon was, paddling around like a duck, furiously like a duck panicking in the water there, because she knew that we were about to present ourselves on an international stage. She knew that the eyes were looking at Glasgow, and they know, that it is SNP run. So, the question is, I think, when all this is over after the next 2 weeks, is what is left for the people? What's left for the Scottish people? What is left for the people, the residents who live there? How will this be resolved?
Emma, quick word on that. I'm keen to get back to renewable energy and COP generally, but a quick word on those comments. Emma Harper.
And again, I'm sure there will be a legacy that comes out of Glasgow. I mean, I totally again, COP isn't over yet. We're still in the middle of it. And, I know that what the statement from the government was that there is absolutely no doubt that our cleansing workers are absolutely crucial to, the function of Glasgow, whether it's in pandemic or not. And obviously, Rachael's highlighted the issues of a lot of police available. Again, that's a security issue because of the world leaders. So it'll be interesting to see the comparison of what's happening on the ground now that some of the House leaders have gone, including Boris, who went for a dinner the other night. So
he's coming back. To be fair, he was only there for the leaders' opening of the 2 days. That was always intended, despite my satire earlier. Emma, with you, let's move on. We've got 8 or 9 minutes left. Let's move on to the issue of Scotland's contribution to not so much COP, but the attempts to tackle climate change. It's something that's been given a great priority by the First Minister. You have Greens in government now as well, and the announcement today is Scotland promising to become a powerhouse of renewable energy. What would that mean, Emma, to your constituents, Daniel's, Rachael's constituents? What changes will people have to experience in their lives? Actual changes? Is it the cars, the boiler? What are we going to have to really change the way we live? Emma Harper first.
I've done some work on the ground. I am a South Scotland regional MSP. It's really rural, but there's a lot of work that we've been doing looking at, chargers for e-cars. There's issues around active travel and cycling. Again, we've got 48% of Scotland's dairy farms in the southwest. Yeah. So obviously there's work being done. So I know that Russell Gregson, the South Scotland enterprise, is looking at supporting a lot of the dairy farmers to do anaerobic digestion and other enhancements to support our agricultural industry. And luckily, I'm in good terms with our local farmers as well. So I'm learning from them what they think they can do. And that's something that, in our part in the south, we've got wind farms, so we worry about cumulative impact. And yes. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but we obviously need to encourage everybody to play their part.
Daniel, is everybody going to have to play their part? And more importantly, are we going to really notice the difference in our life? Have we woken up to this yet, to the extent of the change that is going to be required?
We've not. And the waking up point is really important, because everything Emma said is correct. But at the same time, we are skirting around various elephants in the room. So, elephant in the room number one is that, our base load is derived from two, although I think now just one nuclear power station. And we don't really have a plan for replacement, and renewables by themselves aren't enough. Now, we can get around that, but it requires a plan. Likewise, heating our homes. At the moment, heat pump technology will only heat water to about 50 degrees. And frankly, your radiators are just not going to get your home hot enough with 50-degree temperature water. Yeah. And then, so we need to acknowledge these big holes and come up with a plan to develop them. But then finally,
because you can't just expect people to say, "I'm going to make my life worse." Frankly,
no. Exactly. In fact, it probably has to get a bit better. Yeah. That actually the switch needs to be more convenient and cheaper for people to really do it. And then the final point is this: if we're really going to make this change, become net zero, we have to have a good chunk of the supply chain here. It's not good enough to have our wind turbines made halfway across the world rather than in yards in Fife. So with these challenges coming up, let's have heat pumps built in Scotland. Let's have the solutions and the industry and the jobs here in Scotland, and have a plan to do that rather than shipping it in, importing it, outsourcing our net zero through deindustrializing and shipping the jobs in the factories to China, which is basically what's been happening to date.
Rachael Hamilton, are we ready for the change? Are we aware of the change? Are we aware of the scope that will be required?
Well, Brian, I think young people are very aware of the change because it's a topic of conversation that they're growing up with, and it's being taught in schools, and lots of schools in the borders are trying to do their best and not use single plastics and things like that. And I think that's an important start. That the next generation are going to kind of guide us the way through this. We know that in my constituency in Ettrick, Wroxham, Berwickshire, we're very reliant on fossil fuels. We're very, very reliant on our cars to get from A to B because we don't have a transport system that connects public transport in terms of the buses, and we have a single track line going to Edinburgh. That's fine, but it's not great because people from Berwickshire can't get across to the train station. However, I think Emma makes a good point there about agriculture as well, because I said earlier, agriculture can be part of the solution to this. Now, we know that there's quite a lot of livestock farmers as well. What I would like to see, again, referring to Daniel's point, is that the shorter supply chains. So we then use the example that we've had during the pandemic, where we've looked at those really integral, resilient food supply chains. We've looked at buying seasonally, we've looked at buying locally, and we've actually narrowed that down so that we can actually support people who are producing food on our doorsteps, so that we can actually then produce a low carbon footprint across the borders, because we're supporting each other with a community in a community way. And I think that all the big global kind of commitments sort of get lost when you get down to the community, where we have to think in very small ways.
That's really interesting. That's literally the impact on the ground. I'll bring in the others in a second, but David, we've got COP is a fortnight in duration. We've had the big leader pronouncements. We've had the detailed negotiations getting underway. We've had some big announcements. What can we expect in the next week or so, and more to come?
Well, every day's got a theme here. So there's a few big ones next week, including transport. So we'll see what will happen. But it's all about global efforts. It's this sort of combined working we're seeing on all these announcements. It's trying to get as many countries on board, essentially. And by the end of it, the focus will shift to basically trying to make sure that all countries have plans to implement their promises that they made at the Paris COP, which is... That's
really interesting. So they're being held... Not just the promises made here, but for goodness sake, guys, any chance you can tell us how you're going to deliver on Paris?
Yeah. So the big focus here is to make sure that doesn't go by the wayside. Countries have signed up to this 2 degrees limit and working towards that 1.5, but the plans they've got at the moment are massively inadequate. So that is the focus: is to get those agreements from individual countries that they can reduce their carbon significantly by 2030. A lot of countries don't even have a plan to reduce it at all by 2030. And then hopefully get a deal that will actually keep that 1.5 sort of dream alive, and definitely the 2 degrees that countries have already signed up to.
Keep 1.5 alive. Final word from each of our contributors, please. Daniel Johnson, is it going to be a good? Is it going to be vapid and insignificant? Is it going to be a calamity? What's your take on how this COP26 in Glasgow will go? Will be seen?
First rule of politics, Brian: don't make predictions. So I'm not going to make one. But I think ultimately it boils down to what David just said. I think last time around, what we've built over the last 5 years is that broad commitment. Actually, what we now need to do is break it down, so we have small goals, so it's achievable. And I think that's what we have to see here, so that it's not just one big goal of net zero, but actually the stepping stones to achieve it.
The first rule of politics is actually tell me first. It used to be.
Oh, sorry, Brian.
Used to be at the BBC. Now it's at the Herald. But still.
No,
tell me.
Rule number 2 is don't make predictions.
Rachel Hamilton, seriously, your take on this? Optimistic, pessimistic, somewhere in the middle. What's your take?
So at the moment, I'm really optimistic, and I think I agree with David totally that we need to keep that 1.5 degrees within our reach, and it's important that as we move along the 2 weeks of this COP process, that the technical detail is drawn out, because the Paris Climate Agreement has not yet been finalised, and so that needs to stay ahead of that. If you speak to the real experts in the room, it's going to be live or die. It's going to be that situation. David Attenborough keeps talking about, how important it is to keep that 1.5 degrees alive. And so I think if we're looking at the overriding message, the overarching kind of objective, the collegiate approach, all being in the same tent, breaking down the barriers, I think if that's what we can achieve from this, I think we can keep talking about the future, and we can have a positive future for young people.
Thanks, Rachael. Emma, your take on this, your maybe not prediction, but your take.
Yeah, I'm optimistic, and I hosted an event at the Festival of Politics last week, and Rachel's right about short supply chains, local supply chains. All of the experts on that panel, which was it was about will vegans really save the planet? But all the experts basically said we need to have good welfare for our animals, and it needs to be local supply chains, no matter what our supply chains are. So I'm optimistic, but we also need to help support partnership work and engagement, and we need to show people what CO2 or methane savings they're achieving, and by doing X, Y, and Z. So I think if we can show people the evidence of what all these wee baby steps can do.
What it does, yeah, what you get for your contribution. Emma, thanks. Daniel Johnson, many thanks. Rachel Hamilton, thanks. And David Ball, thank you very much indeed. And thanks to you, thanks to all of you for tuning in, watching, listening, whatever one does with a podcast. From me, Brian Taylor.
This podcast was brought to you by The Herald. Take 20% off an annual subscription to The Herald with our exclusive podcast code. Just add HeraldPod 2021 to your basket and get instant, unfiltered access to our website. And you can also get involved with the Brian Taylor podcast as well. Tune in on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube every Thursday afternoon to catch Brian and his panel chat live and ask your questions to the people across the political scene.